I'm Steve Wilson, and I'm the curator of the film collection at the Harry Ransom Center. Welcome to our program today. I'm here with Kendra Leonard. She's the executive director of the Silent Film Sound and Music Archive and was a recipient of a research fellowship from the Harry Ransom Center in 2016. Welcome, Kendra. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
We are here to talk about music for silent films in general, and specifically about music for silent films in Texas as performed, assembled and performed by Hazel Burnett. We have her papers here. They were donated by her granddaughter, Josephine Burnett, to the Harry Ransom Center in 2002. But I want to start talking about just kind of silent music, silent film music in general. I've got some pictures to show you. Let's see, share screen. In the mid 19 teens, the Nickelodeons just kind of exploded in popularity across the country, including in Austin. This is the Bijou Theater. We don't know much about it except that it was here in Austin, probably somewhere near the intersection of 6th Street and Congress Avenue here in Austin. And these Nickelodeons they were everywhere. They just came and went. This one, the Bijou, closed almost as soon as it opened. By 1925, though, at the height of the silent era, more vaudeville theaters started installing projectors, and you started to see more purpose-built movie theaters. And by 1925, at the height of the silent era, there were some 20,000 movie theaters in the United States, and 3/4 of those theaters were in small towns. And I would consider Austin a small town at that time. The bigger, fancier movie palaces were in the larger urban areas. But from the beginning, music was always regarded as an essential part of the program. And in most theaters, especially the larger theaters like the Majestic that we were just saying, the evening's program would begin with opening music from the house orchestra, followed by live entertainment for 20, 30 minutes. And this live entertainment might include a dance troupe like the Rockettes at Radio City Music Hall, a swing band, a singer like Bing Crosby or Frank Sinatra, Eddie Cantor, and that would go on for a little while, and then there would be a short, comedy short, cartoons, almost always a newsreel, and then that would be followed by the feature film. And this kind of presentation continued well into the 1930s, all the way. I've seen material in our interstate collection that this kind of program went all the way up through World War II. And so until the advent of synchronized sound in the early 1930s, it started in 1928, but it took them a while to install the sound equipment across the country. But until synchronized sound came in, all of this program was with live music performed by the musicians in the movie theaters. The larger theaters would often have an orchestra, maybe 10 to as many as 40 for a very big collection or a very big theater. But anyway, in the mid 1920s, movie theaters were the largest employers of musicians in the United States. So in smaller towns like Austin, Well, in the larger theaters, the music would be assembled, put together by the music director. Is that right? From the theater, or the conductor?
It is. The
Um,
music director, who is often also the conductor,
yeah,
would have an extensive music library to draw on and could put together score and parts for musicians using just that.
yeah. And so, where did this music come from? They didn't just improvise everything. They got
Um,
sheet music from somewhere. How did
yeah.
that? Tell us about how that how that came about. How the music was put together for
Well,
these
there
programs.
certainly were musicians who improvised, and some of them improvised using popular songs and things that the audience would know. But most music really came from what we call a cue sheet. Now, at your biggest theaters for your biggest movies, your A-list film with all your stars, the studio might have a score commissioned by a composer and send it out along with the reels for the film. But that didn't guarantee that that score was used for performing. Often scores went out to orchestras that didn't have the forces for it or just didn't like it. So the music directors would make a list of the cues in the film, what happens when and how long that scene lasts. And then they would look for pieces of music that could fit that length and fit the mood. Musicians could also buy ready-made cue sheets. What you see here on the screen is for Mad Hour. This is a typical cue sheet. This is by the Thematic Cue Sheet Company. This was one of the biggest companies. They hired composers and directors to put together these cues. So you get to see at screening, that means the very beginning, and there's a melody there that cinema musicians would be able to take and flesh out and arrange for the full ensemble that they had. And then as each different title comes up or each scene comes up, they move on to the next piece. So this was the most common way of doing things. Music directors could buy sheet music from dozens of publishers. And by 1910, composers had started writing short atmospheric pieces specifically to use in making a compiled score, a score made of different pieces. We call it genre music because the pieces fell into specific genres. There's music for chases, love scenes, spooky encounters, and so on. You can see
So,
here, this
yeah,
is a piece that was in Hazel Burnett's archive.
right.
And you can see that she's picked out the love theme, item number 7. And she's obviously used this a lot because she's reinforced the binding with tape and she's punched holes in it so she can put it in a binder of pieces. So she would be playing a film, and every time there's a new clue, she would turn to a new page. And this would be one of the pages in that binder for her compiled score.
Yeah. I want to take a closer look at some of these things. This is a piece of sheet music, thematic, and up at the top says can be featured in Western cabaret scenes. Got another example here. SOS can be used for storms at sea, shipwrecks, and mob scenes. So this is the kind of music you were talking about, the genre music that was used for different moods, different themes, that kind of thing.
Exactly. And you'll see that a lot of these pieces are not super technical or complicated. If you've played piano at any point in your past, you can see that things are kind of simple. Nothing gets too technically difficult because publishers wanted to make sure that the people using this music could play it right away and make it sound good from the first time.
Yeah, yeah. I want to focus on this item a bit. This is a cue sheet that you described, and kind of want to zoom in a little bit at the top. I don't know who Winifred is, but I assume she was a very young fan. And this is for a movie called Branded Sombrero. This is a cue sheet for Branded Sombrero, the Fox feature film production. William Fox this became Fox Film, later 20th Century Fox, and so on. And Buck Jones was probably his top cowboy star in the silent era. And we could do a whole program on Buck Jones. He's a fascinating guy. Was in the Spanish-American War in the cavalry. Went on to star in some of the Wild West live shows, and eventually ended up in movies, and was a huge star. But I want to talk about the cue sheet and how it worked. As you mentioned, the first cue at screening is when the movie started. Is that right?
It is. So you'd have the drapes pulled aside, or the screen comes forward.
Mm-hmm.
You've cleared off everything from the vaudeville act that went before it, whether that is Spangles or chicken feathers, depending where you are and what kind of live act it is, right?
Yeah.
So you have this music that sets the scene for the film. Now, the entertainment that came right before the film, the newsreel and things like that, sometimes pianists would work in little hints of what they were going to play for the feature as well, so that people were starting to hear those themes. But at screening is where we first get a really good idea of what this movie is going to be about through the way the music is used and what kind of music we're using. And here we're using, quick music, and it's got some syncopation, and it promises an interesting ride to come.
Now, over on the right side, it'll give you some ideas about the what music to play, who the composer is and whatnot, and it'll give you a timing, an approximate timing. But the thing that I wanted to point out is up here at the top. It says the timing is based on a speed of 12 minutes per reel. And this speaks to the fact that the speed of the projector was not standardized at this point. They were filming silent era movies, usually at about 16, 18 frames per second. It was kind of loose. I mean, they were hand cranking a lot of times. And the projector I don't know if it was hand cranked or it had a variable speed motor, but it was not a standard, speed. And it was up to the musician, right, to follow the movie and keep up or slow down as need be to keep pace with the film.
Right. You don't want to have so much music that you stop in an awkward place when a scene changes, and you don't want to have too little music so that you have to repeat yourself a lot in a scene. So movie houses that were able to get films in a day before they started screening them, or the morning before they started screening in the afternoon, that was a really big help to the musicians for that film, because they got to see it and know what to expect. At some houses, the accompanists didn't see the film until they had to play for it the very first time. So they were playing it cold. And that's where cue sheets can really come in helpful, because it gives you at least a theme that you can play from. Even if you don't have all of the pieces it recommends in your music library, or you can't put all those together, for the time that you play the film, at least you have something to go on. And I think that's why the cue sheet was so popular, because movies changed very quickly at theaters. They were there for 2 or 3 days and they were gone. Sometimes they would come back, but things moved on really fast. And of course, the newsreels changed frequently as well. Right. So to have a cue sheet for the film that you were going to do was an enormous help.
Now, where would you get these cue sheets? Did they come with the film, or did you go buy them, or was there a subscription service? Or
most of them you had to go buy. For a long time, some of the studios tried putting out cue sheets with their films. And so sometimes you'll see at the top, at the header of the cue sheet, that it's been issued by the studio itself. But more common were sort of these third-party organizations. Now, some of these were they were also owned by the studio, but they weren't under direct studio control, right? So there were a lot of companies, the Thematic Cue Sheet company, the MJ Mintz company that we see here, that was probably one of the biggest ones. They had the top names and people who arranged the cues and made compiled scores, and also people who had written full scores for films that they commissioned them. So you could buy these at your local music store usually, but often the theater needed to order them in advance. So a theater musician, an organist, or a pianist would go to their boss, the manager of the theater, and say, hey, I need to get the next couple of cue sheets for what we've got coming in. Can we get those, in the mail or at the music store? And remember, this is a time when lots and lots of people started having pianos in their home for the first time. The piano became more affordable for people. So there were sheet music stores everywhere, and they sold songs that were popular and attached to some of the films and all sorts of other things. So the idea of going to your local music store and finding music that would easily fit a film was a lot easier than what we need to do today.
Yeah. And there were music magazines too, right? I've got the Etude here. And Melody, what was it? Melody Maker?
Melody Magazine.
Melody Magazine.
For the home pianist and photo player was its subtitle for a while, because it catered directly to cinema pianists and organists. The Etude is really important in Hazel Burnett's story because she was a subscriber for a very, very long time. And she would cut pieces of music out of the magazine and label them for use in silent films that she was accompanying. So the Etude published both articles and ads and pieces of music. And usually the pieces of music it published were very short. They might have, a piece that was only 16 measures long, so maybe not even 30 seconds. But it might have the perfect theme for a chase on horseback. So Hazel would cut it out and stick it in her stash of stuff. And when she needed to, she would pull out these bits and put them together as a compiled score. I have to think that there were other cinema companies doing this as well, because the Etude was publishing these short character pieces. So rather than a long sort of abstract piece, they were very short. And it was things like Spring Rose or Moonlight on the Boat, right? So they were these very characteristic titles and pieces, perfect for using in film accompaniment.
Yeah, and you talked a bit about Jacob's incidental music, and there's lots of other examples in Hazel's papers about short pieces of the genre music that you mentioned, composed for film, for movies, not a specific movie, but just for general
Any
use.
movie. Yep. These albums or collections of pieces were called Photoplay albums, and they contained 8 to 10 pieces usually. The one on the screen now, the Jacobs, it looks like they offered 24 different pieces that you could then put all together in a book or a notebook. A lot of them did that. A lot of the companies did that. But you could also buy books that had 7 or 8 pieces in the book, and you had all those pieces ready to go whenever you needed them. So Hazel had a number of these, and some of them are marked up. So we have kind of an idea which ones she used in the films, but we have no idea what films they were. It's
right.
It is hard to sync up a piece with a film. I've been able to do it in a couple of cases with her music. But when there's a piece of music and it just says Q15 on it,
right?
You might know what year it's published, so that helps a little bit, but other than that, there are thousands of films with Q15.
Yeah. Hazel's papers include a number of albums of just popular music, but also music for films like this one. Yeah. And this is an especially important company, right? The Joseph Carl Braille. Am I saying that right?
Yeah, he was a big name, so this would have sold a lot of copies. He was one of the first composers to write full-length scores for feature films. It had been done before. There were shorter films that had full scores. Right. Even Camille Saint-Saëns, the French composer, wrote one. In fact, his is one of the first that we know of. Braille came into popularity when he scored this huge Italian epic called Cabiria that traveled all around the world and did huge business in the theaters, and a lot of the theaters used his score. And then he went on to score a bunch of longer films. So he started issuing these shorter pieces as well, capitalizing on the fact that people knew who he was and respected him as a film composer. So there are a number of albums that he put together, which is Chappell Company, which was a big publisher of genre music, like this one. So inside this one, there would be several different pieces, different moods, different tempos, a fast piece, a slow piece, a piece that's perfect for dancing, things like that people could use.
Well, want to focus everything that we're showing you today, all of the manuscript material and all that is from Hazel Burnett's collection that I mentioned before, was donated to the Ransom Center in 2002 by Hazel's granddaughter, Josephine Burnett. The collection is 7 document boxes. It includes these kinds of publications that we have been showing you, and the music dates from about 1917, as far as I can tell, to about the late 1930s, and it's just fascinating insight into the cultural life of Texas and Ohio. She moved back and forth between Texas and Ohio. I want to read her Hazel's bio. This is Hazel in front of the Aztec Theater in San Antonio. I want to read her bio that Josephine sent. She says, as you asked about my grandmother, here's a short bio. She was born Hazel Manzor Hewins. Her name later became Hazel Hewins Burnett Wooden Hilton McGaw. Granny was a flapper and had 4 husbands. I know that she studied music, but where I do not know. The family constantly moved from Cincinnati, Ohio, and San Antonio. Her mother and father were both dentists. She married at the age of 16 in 1910 and had 1 son in 1912, my father, Hugh Eugene Burnett Jr. About 6 years later, she divorced and later remarried as Mrs. Wooden. And this appears to be about the time when she performed the most, as it is the name on most of the music. And she did. She wrote her name on virtually every sheet of music. I found the names of several theaters in Ohio, the Aztec in San Antonio, and the Majestic in Austin. The Majestic, of course, changed its name to the Paramount Theater. It's still an open, still running movies and live shows and all of that now. In 1925, Granny graduated from the University of Cincinnati, first dental class and the only woman in that class, and returned to San Antonio to practice dentistry. Dr. Wooden became her professional name, and she remained a dentist until her retirement. This is Hazel here. So based on this bio, it is easy to imagine a single mother in about 1917, 1918, getting gigs at the movie theater, maybe at churches. She's got a child at home she has to feed. It was an interesting time. World War I was going on. There was a Spanish flu pandemic, much like we have now. It was makes her out to be a really interesting person, I think.
Hazel is amazing to me. I love her whole story. The job of a cinema accompanist was a respectable one for women. And I think that's a really important part of her story, especially after American men were sent to war. And in fact, there are stories of cinema orchestras closing down because they were all male and all the men were sent off for war work. Women really came to their own as cinema accompanists. And there's a long history of why they excelled at this job, in part because the pieces that they had been expected to learn to be accomplished ladies were these short character pieces that became genre music in the cinema. And for Hazel, she's playing in some really big theaters, and
Yeah.
she makes a name for herself. She is well known. She becomes sort of one of these celebrity organists, and I can imagine that she might have started off playing for day shows, right? You could go to the cinema at 10:30 in the morning and you could spend your whole day there. And then there would be different entertainment in the evening. You could stay for that as well, which Steve will talk about in a second. But I can imagine her dropping off her child at school, going in and playing all these shows during the school day, and then being able to pick him up at, after school and take him home or do other activities. The Aztec had a huge capacity. So there's every chance that there were days when she was playing for several thousand people if there was a really popular show. And so, and the fact that she decided to go into another trade, part of it is her parents are dentists, but also, it seems to me that she sees the coming of sound from pretty far away, that she's very prescient about this, looking for another job, because of course, when sound did come, we have thousands and thousands of unemployed cinema musicians who suddenly need other kinds of employment.
Right. So let me get to this. This is what I wanted to say. We found this in Hazel's papers, and this is her handwritten cue sheet for the film Humoresque. Here's a film still from that. And it is the story of a child prodigy who grows up and becomes an accomplished concert violinist, and he is in love with his childhood sweetheart, but he decides to go off to war in World War I and comes back injured and unable to play. I won't ruin the rest of the the plot for you, but Hazel assembled a compiled score for Humoresque. What have you maybe found out about this cue sheet that she put together?
I'll start off by saying this is one of the best finds I have found in doing work on silent film music. I was so excited to open a page of a piece of sheet music and see this written in it. It just was amazing. So Humoresque, as Steve talked, is this sort of tug on your heartstrings kind of film. It does have a happy ending. I'll reveal that. And there was a set of recommendations, a cue sheet of a kind that was published in one of the major industry trade magazines in their music for the film column. But Hazel's choices are quite different, and I think it's really fascinating. She's relying in part on music she already knew and that she already has to help make playing the score a little bit easier. In this, she uses the traditional Jewish melody Kol Nidra, which was a very common accompaniment for any kind of depiction of Jews on screen. So anytime you're showing a rabbi, we hear, the accompanist plays the Kol Nidra. We might hear, I don't know, people at prayer, it's always the Kol Nidra, right? So she uses that, which is pretty common and was used in other scores for Humoresque. But then she picks out these other pieces, and we were able to actually find copies of all of these, which is not always that common. There is so much music that's lost. It's in print, it falls apart, the paper is thin. So we found all of these pieces, and they make a really interesting score. And I think it's one that fits the score really beautifully. She's done a lot of work timing things and thinking about how long the themes of pieces last, and what pieces she's going to use. She uses several themes throughout. It's Humoresque is the title of the film, so of course we have to use Dvorak's famous Humoresque piece for violin as the main theme. But then she's got some really interesting other pieces. She's got some popular music here. Funicula was a popular piece. Legend of a Rose was sort of this romantic popular work that we would have heard a lot if we were going to the cinema and things like that. And then she pulls out some big guns. She uses some work from Massenet, which is really lush and beautiful. She has Hungarian Rhapsody written here. And there's a question as to just whose Hungarian Rhapsody that might be, because there are so many of them, right, between Liszt and Brahms and everyone else. But if it's probably the Brahms one that people knew the most, and it's a rousing end to the film a little bit. So what she's done here in writing all of this out is that she's given us a record of what she would have played every time she accompanied this film. Mm-hmm. And it's just a phenomenal document that, you know, sheds light on her tastes as well as the music she already had and newer music that she wanted to bring in as she was accompanying the film.
Yeah, and that brings up the point that these women like Hazel, who were, you know, in their small town, playing in movie theaters and churches and group you know, events and things like that, had a big impact on the cultural life and the tastes of their community. And I just think that's really fascinating insight into the times of then.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, when synchronized sound became obviously a success, right? Theaters had already started moving to the West Coast. The big studio system was already getting started on the West Coast. Mm-hmm. But what's interesting is that not very many of the silent film musicians or composers for silent films moved with them. They stayed on the East Coast. They turned their cinema orchestras into dance orchestras. They did other things for a living, but they didn't go out to the West. But the people who started composing for films made in the 1930s, they would have heard people like Hazel playing in the cinema. You know, we don't know exactly who heard what, right? Did Max Winkler, the famous Hollywood composer, ever hear Hazel Burnett play, you know, the accompaniment to a film? We don't know. What we do know is that if you were a child in the 1920s and you were going to the theater, you were hearing mostly women accompanying silent film. So your tastes as a composer, you know, as you come of age in the 1930s and start composing yourself, your tastes have been shaped by what these women have been playing in the cinema. You've gotten used to the choices that they have made based on available music and their own taste for all sorts of different cinematic situations. So, you know, how much of the score for Rebecca do we owe to women in the cinema, right? How much of the score for Gone with the Wind do we owe to silent film music? Steve is an expert here in Gone with the Wind, and I'm sure he could talk about that. But I would argue, and I don't know if you would agree, I would argue that the score for Gone with the Wind is in a lot of ways like a silent film score, where there's sort of a cue sheet, right? A lot of the music is original, but we also have these strains of Dixie and other things like that.
That's right.
And it's sort of put together in a way that we have music for each scene. It doesn't sort of go from one scene to the next, right? So we hear that influence. We hear the influence of the silent film accompanist, even in films, you know, written today.
Well, I just think this is a fascinating insight into the movie-going experience at that time, and it's just really fascinating. And thank you so much for being here to talk about it. We are at the point now where we should be taking questions. And I want to encourage people to write in questions. I think you can write it in your comment section of where Facebook or YouTube or wherever you're watching. We have one question so far from Elizabeth from YouTube. Have you talked to or met anyone who accompanied silent films? And have you talked to any audience members who remember hearing it? And I think she means, you know, from back then. There's lots of people who there's kind of a resurgence in interest in silent films, and
There is.
and there's a couple of really wonderful film festivals: the San Francisco Silent Film Festival, and the Pordenone Film Festival, and there are several that are really getting to be known. So there are people who are accompanying silent films now, but I think she means from back then.
You know, we are right at that point. We're right at that point in time where people of the age, if they were adults playing films in the teens and 20s, most of them are no longer with us.
Yeah.
Every once in a while, I will run into somebody who was very young when they started playing silent films. And this was not uncommon. Yeah. There were, people ages 10, 12, if they played the piano or the organ, they were going to go play silent films. I have talked briefly with a few people who did that. They said they were sort of filling in. It was more toward the end of the silent era, and they, they knew that sound was coming. But we do have lots and lots of interviews with people who played, which is great. One of the people that I am fascinated by is Rosa Rio. Rosa Rio was a celebrity organist in New York. She had humble beginnings in Kentucky or Ohio, and became the cinema organist to end all cinema organists. She would play in this bejeweled organ that rose out of the ground up to the stage on a hydraulic lift, and she was just decked out in the most fabulous gowns ever. And we have lots of recordings with her, and we also have recordings of her playing for the films. Now, she was someone who said she always improvised. Her form of improvisation, though, was to play the film the first time through just improvising and doing whatever she could to kind of match it. But then she would start writing down cues. So she would write down themes that she had composed while she was improvising, but she would also write down themes of pieces that she knew that she could stick in there as well. We don't have any of these cues written down for us because she was always writing them down like on the backs of things and on napkins and receipts. But we do have a bunch of videotapes that she made. She did a whole bunch of tapes. Some of them are now on DVD, so you can hear her play, and some of them have interviews with her. So if you're interested in hearing someone talk about their experience as a silent film accompanist, she is the person to look up online.
And she played the organ as opposed to the piano. Is that right?
She did. She started off on the piano and then became an organist. Yeah.
What about the role of the Wurlitzer in silent film music?
Oh my gosh,
that may take us down another rabbit hole.
But that's all right, because it's exciting. The Wurlitzer was a big deal, right? So in the 19-teens, you could go to a mid-sized cinema and you might have an ensemble you might just have a pianist, but you might have an ensemble of maybe 3 to 8 players, depending on how big it was and how much they could afford, right? Because extra musicians cost more. By the time the Wurlitzer starts coming out, and the Wurlitzer is competing with older forms of the organ, right? Like pump organs and the kinds of church organs you hear, right? By the time the Wurlitzer starts being developed, all of a sudden cinema organists have all these new options. And in fact, the guy who helped build the Hammond organ, which was a big competitor with the Wurlitzer, was Rosa Rio's husband. But the Wurlitzer was super fancy and it looked amazing, right? The Wurlitzer company made record players and these organs and fancy jukeboxes. They're the ones that light up with all the neon and they're like bubbles that go around them. Well, these organs looked just like that. They looked futuristic and they had all sorts of new sounds in them so that it was easier, for example, to get the sound of strings playing and be able to control the volume of it a little bit better and things like that. So the Wurlitzer became, it was the way to go. If you had a theater and you wanted to upgrade your music area, you installed a Wurlitzer. There were also automated instruments. There were automated pianos, sort of like player pianos with all these extra parts. Those were also really popular too. They cost a lot. And so when theaters put them in, it was a big deal. So the newspaper would say, the new piano has been installed today and it costs this many thousands of dollars and we can't wait to hear if it's worth it, but yeah, there were pianists and organists who made their name with the Wurlitzer, and it just became an icon, of silent music accompaniment.
Yeah. The Mary Pickford Theater at the Motion Picture Academy, they have this incredible thing. It's
Yeah.
basically an organ, but it also has all these sound effects
Yes.
built into it. So you could do horse galloping or a
Yeah.
train whistle or a gunshot or thing. It had all those pre-built in that you could hit a knob and play this sound effect. And sound
Yeah.
effects were part of the sound of silent film music, right?
Sound effects were a big deal. You wanted to add that texture. You didn't have Foley sound either,
Yeah.
right? Sometimes people, they'd be like, oh, but you hear the sound of a door opening, or there's no Foley sound. So in some theaters, performers would specialize in sound effects. We think today there's the joke in Monty Python of hitting the coconuts together to make the horse sound.
Yeah.
That's exactly what people were doing
That's
in the
right.
music pit with movies with horses. They were there with their coconuts. So yeah, a lot of these instruments were built with whistles and horns and xylophone sounds. So you could get all of these percussive elements. You could get a bird whistle. So it could be very, very ornate. You could do all sorts of things with your instrument to accompany the film.
Well, we've had a couple of other questions come in. Melanie on Facebook asked, do we know what Hazel's wages were as a pianist and film?
That's a great question. So finding exact wage information is not the easiest thing in the world. It would be great if we could go back and look at everybody's taxes, but right. So what I do know is that in major metropolitan areas, cinema organists could be paid up to $70 a week. And this is on par with teachers and nurses in terms of how much people are making. In other places, if you had a really big following, obviously you could make more than that. A lot of cinema organists had two jobs. They would play at one theater and then they might also play at their church, or they would play at one theater and then they would be a substitute at a different theater if someone got ill or they needed an extra person to come in and things like that. But it was a decent paying job. And you could, I think, pretty easily survive on it as your sole source of income. Certainly plenty of people did. I think Hazel is posing there with her car is kind of a boast. It's here's where I work and here's what I've been able to buy with the money I make. And this was not really uncommon with publicity and information about cinema accompanists. There was a woman in Chicago named Mildred Fitzpatrick who became a celebrity organist in Chicago. And there was a big article in the paper there about how she had been able to buy a Cadillac, which was a really big deal and top of the line based on her income as a cinema accompanist.
We've got a question from Ian. Was Hazel listed? Was there a program or bill or something like that at the theater? And was she listed or was she known as the person accompanying the film?
I think she was known. I think that photo indicates that she was known. I have not found anything in the collection with her name on it, with her name printed on it. Now, having said that, it's been a while since I've gone through the collection, and some of my notes, even I have trouble figuring out what I'm supposed to be saying in some of these notes because they're transcribed from handwritten things and things like that. I haven't seen anything with her name on it. Steve, maybe have you seen stuff in the collection?
I have not.
Anything printed?
No,
so
I have not.
I think we'd have to look a little bit more. She does have some publicity materials in there for theaters where I think she was playing as part of an event. But I haven't seen her name specifically called out. It's definitely something that I'd love to find. I have to say, archivists probably don't like this, but I have to say that as a scholar, I find a lot of stuff on eBay,
Yeah.
and you never know when something is going to come up on eBay, or when a family member is going to find something and stick it on ancestry.com,
Right.
and
Right.
then you have more context for what you've got in the archives, in the boxes. And I encourage people who have this material to stop selling it on eBay and to give it to archives instead.
Yes, please.
Please do that.
Kathy on YouTube says, Kendra, what kind of skills does it take to watch a film and play accompaniment on the fly? And was that done?
It was done. That's how Rosaria started doing hers. Yeah. A lot of people had to do that because, like I said before, the films didn't stay very long at each theater. So you might get a film in the mail Monday afternoon, and you might have to start playing it Monday night. So you don't always get a chance to see it ahead of time. I think the skills that you need are really strong basic piano skills. I think you need to be able to move from key to key with ease. I think you need to be able to look at a film and anticipate what might happen next. So it's good to be familiar with the different genres of the films, right? So once you've played 5 different romance films, you have an idea of what's going to happen in other romance films. Nothing is really breaking out of its genre. If you have a Western, you know that you're going to have chases, that you might have to provide music for Native Americans, which has its own problematic history. You would need to be able to, come up with pretty tunes, as well as sort of, general things like marches and waltzes and things like that. So it would help if you had, I would say, the equivalent of a couple of years of piano lessons. You don't have to be super accomplished, but you do have to be familiar with the keyboard and either have a good memory for music that you like, so you can just, churn it out while you're watching, or be able to come up with things, be very imaginative and be able to create a melody, and play the harmony for it at the same time. But it didn't have to be super complicated. And one of the things that I like about Hazel's collection too is that she had all these pieces for small hands. Yeah. And this was a thing. It's not done as much now, but like major pieces that called for a big reach by the pianist or organist, they were rewritten so that you didn't hurt your hands and you could still play the piece. And it was very acceptable then. Today, I think if a concert artist did that, we would think it was an abomination. But then it was really common. So you didn't even have to have, really big piano hands or anything like that, because you could just play what you were comfortable with.
Got one more question from online, and then I have a final question. Betsy on YouTube, did the early Saturday matinees for children use the same concept in the music chosen?
Yeah, they did. And
I would imagine so.
You could buy specific Photoplay albums, like we talked about those books that had 10 or 12 short pieces that were all sort of the same. You could buy those specifically for kids shows and for cartoons. You could also use music for animals. There was a lot of animal music that was just kind of funny and buoyant and happy. You could use that. So it was the same idea. Yeah, it wasn't sort of like, oh, it's a kid's thing, I'm just going to phone it in. I think people really took the time to make sure the music fit the picture. And yeah, there was a lot of music that could do that. But I love looking at the movie for the stuff specifically for cartoons, because it's even, we have music, it's like for a chase scene, for horses. This is for like when an animal escapes, when someone gets tangled in a leash, when someone gets a pie in the face, right? I mean, it's things that are a little bit more light, it's not, Tom takes out his gun to shoot the bear. It's very much, it's very much on the happier side of things.
Well, in close, we're pretty much out of time. I wanted to mention that we do intend to have Hazel's entire collection digitized and put that online on the Ransom Center's website. We also have another similar collection that is from one of those larger, this is from the Palace Theater in Dallas. which had a 30-piece orchestra, and the Ransom Center holds their sheet music library as well. And that's going to be a much bigger project to digitize that, but it's very, very rich.
It's going to be so helpful. We're going to learn so much when these collections are online and more people can look at them and bring their expertise and discover stuff about it. I'm so glad you're doing this.
It's got the Palace collection has a significant number of items. This is from that collection, and this is a piece of music that is pasted to some cardboard, I guess, so that it would stand up on the music stand. This is a piano, but it's all different, flute, violin, and everything. This particular sheet of music is pasted to cardboard that is a silent film lobby card that's been cut. And there's a significant number of these. So it's kind of a hidden collection within the collection of visual imagery from that era on top of the music. So when we do that, we will have to scan both sides of the page.
Yes.
Well, Kendra, again, thank you so much. I really appreciate you being here to talk about it. It's been really fun putting this together and just really fascinating for me to talk about the movie-going experience in 100 years ago. Thank you for being here with us.
Thank you for having me. This has been great. And if people have other questions, you can send them to Steve at the Ransom Center.
Yep.
And if he needs to forward them to me, he'll do that, or you can find me online as well. I'm always happy to answer questions and talk about this subject.
Great. Well, thanks so much, and we'll talk again soon.